Okay, so hi, welcome back. Hope everybody had a fun fall break. So diving right back into it, today we're going to be talking about table views. So table views is hello, Shingo. So table views is a way of kind of creating a composite view. So previously in last week's lecture, we talked about how we can have these kind of stacks, right? When we kind of think about it as like pancakes, we're pushing views on top of each other. And then I also talked about a present view controller. We kind of have this view slide in from bottom to top, right? So, those are some ways of having multiple views. But another way of doing it is having a table view controller. And you've actually seen this probably like 5, 10, 20, 100 times a day when you use your phone, if you have an iPhone. And the reason why I say that is because they don't all look the same. You can customize it a lot, but functionally, they're kind of built based on a same framework. And so today we're going to be talking about this framework, the skeleton of it, and how you can customize it yourself. Okay, so it's called table views, and I can advance my slides. Oh, there we go. Okay, so first of all, what is a UI table view? UI table view is basically a way for you to present a scrollable list of items. So say, for example, your Spotify, right? You have a bunch of songs and you want to kind of present them in a certain way. So that's like the playlist screen, right? So that would be a very natural a natural use case of using a table view, right? Because you want to present a list of items. And, if you have like more than 10, then you probably don't want to have them all on the screen. So you can have the users scroll to see all the things. And um, in terms of how it's represented, the idea is that you want to represent them as cells. So every row is a cell. And in order for things to work together, so for example, if you have a table and then above that you have some tabs and stuff like that, right? You want to implement these delegation and protocol patterns that we talked about a lot last week. But you'll see a lot of these in today's lecture, as well as the demo on Wednesday, where we walk you through kind of creating your first table view, and that will be pretty similar to what you need to do on this week's project as well. Okay, so I talked about Spotify. Here's an example. So actually, there are two examples. So the right-hand side is the Spotify example I talked about just now. And the idea is that you see how these rows here, so I don't care with Justin Bieber allowed something, that is like a row, right? And it's like repeated multiple times, right? So the idea is you can already kind of guess that you have this structure that you set once for the row. It's called a table view cell. And you just reuse that layout multiple times for each row. Okay. So if you use Spotify, you've seen this multiple times. And if you don't use Spotify, right, you hopefully used settings before. And this, maybe it's a little less fleshed out, right? But this is also a table view. And the idea is that instead of having kind of a bunch of information here, maybe if you download it or not, the author's name, stuff like that, right? You just have one line of text, an image, and some button over there, right? And that's also a table view. But the idea is, the core fundamental idea of a table view is you have a scrollable list of items, and these items are cells. Okay. All right. So now we kind of dive more into the details of a table view. So I talked about rows, right? And how rows, each row contains a cell, but there's actually one more level above that, and it's called a section. So going back to this, actually, I think I did do it here. Yeah, I do it here. Okay, so going back to this settings example, right? So we do have rows here, right? Each of these rows have a cell in it. So this is like your cell, right? But you can also have the rows be split by section. So over here we have like the common settings. Over here we have the notifications and whatever settings, and down there you have more settings, right? So you can actually change the spacing based on the section. And what you can also do is say you want this section to be like a different color, right? You want this section to have a different type of cell, right? And this section to have another different type of cell, right? That's also something you can customize, right? So it gives you another layer of customization on top of your table view cell. But if you just want a very bare bones list of items that you just want to display, right, in a bunch of rows, then you can have just one section, and in that section you just have your rows, right? So yeah, the section idea of splitting up your rows is entirely optional. And a lot of times people, instead of using the section, they just use separate table views. But this is an option if you choose to use it. Okay, so as I mentioned just now, each section has a bunch of rows in it, and the customization you get with each section is like entirely up to you. So over here, you see how in the first section, this is still a row, but you see how it looks very, very different, and it contains a lot of different information compared to like these rows down here. Okay, so yeah, that's something that you can customize. And I think we'll be showing this in the demo on Wednesday. So inside each row, we have a UI table view cell. And this is actually very similar to the default implementation. The default implementation of a table view cell is just one label, right? And you can also like specify its right icon, its left icon. So this right icon would be like an arrow, and then the left icon would just be this hourglass thing, right? So there's actually this you can implement with like probably 2 lines of code. But of course you do more customizations if you want. And so yeah, a good example is like the one up here where you have, like a profile image and then some more description and then like a different height and stuff like that. Okay. All right. So there are 4 main parts of our table view. The bottom part, like the last part, sorry, of cells I talked about just now, but the idea is that the cells is just the way you kind of lay out the data that you see. So over here, the cell, like, you can see my cursor, right? Oh yeah, here. So over here, the cell will just contain an icon, a label here, and this is a UI toggle button, right? So that, like that kind of thinking, you would be writing that line of code in the cell file. And these 3 things up here are basically how you have your table view communicate with wherever your data is being stored, right? We talked about delegates before, but the idea is that you use the delegate to kind of communicate between different views. And so you can have a table view controller just be an entire like view by itself, or you can have it nested within kind of a parent view controller, right? Regardless of how you choose to do it, you'll be using this delegate. So, you create like the idea of like a protocol, right? You have a delegate, you pass in the delegate and you use the delegate to call functions, right? Hopefully this is familiar from last week. But the idea is that you use this delegate to pass information from the table view to its parent view, or from the cell to the table view, etc. Okay. Okay, 2 more things. So the data source, I just noticed I'm going from bottom to top, but okay. Anyways, so the data source is basically what kind of like it's pretty self-explanatory actually. It's like the source where you get the data from. But the idea is that the table view displays a list of items, right? So at some point you need to kind of specify, what this list of items is. And the way you do that is when you, and we'll see this more later, but when you initialize the table view, you would have to do the table view dot data source equals to something, right? And that something is going to be probably an array, right? Or a list or some other data structure that you create to represent the items. Okay. And then finally, the table view controller is just like the parent file where you kind of set up all the table view things. And there's going to be some functions that you have to specify, right? So for example, how many sections do I want, right? How tall do I want the cells to be, right? Those are things that you have to configure as well. And that code goes into the table view controller. Okay. So this is a very high level overview of like the 4 main parts of a table view. Any questions just yet? Okay, cool. All right. So let's look at how kind of creating a table view is slightly different from the views that we've been working with from the past few projects, right? So you've maybe worked with labels, you've worked with buttons, right? And a lot of the times what you're really doing is you do like say for example you're making a button, right? So you say like login button is equal to UI button, right, over here. And then you set the translate auto resizing masking into false, and then you add maybe round corners, some background color, some different font, and then you're done, right? And then you just add to the view, and then you do some constraints. So that's the standard process we've been following for most of these view kind of components. But there is a little more that you have to do when you're using a table view controller, and as well as the collection view controller, which we'll be talking about next week. The idea is that you need to set up these 3 more things, right? So let me go through them one by one. First one, data source, right? So just now I talked about how the data source being one of the 4 main things you need for a table view controller. Sorry, for a table view. But basically the table source is where am I going to get my data from? Okay. So self here is, it may not make too much sense when you look at it for the first time, but the idea is that you're in a parent view controller, right? So the idea is that you're in like the root of your entire project. So that's like the very first view controller that you work with, right? It's called the view controller, or you can think of it as like the parent view controller. And in that view controller, you're creating this table view, right? So you think about like even in Spotify, you have like a home screen, and on that home screen you kind of put a table view, right? So like the table view itself is not like the parent. So, it must get its data from somewhere, right? So ideally it gets it from its parent. And since you're kind of creating this table view in the parent, then self will be referring to the parent. Okay, so that's basically what table view.data source equals self means, right? Whenever you create a table view, you would also have to set this table view.data source equal to self. So hopefully that explanation made it more clear what you're actually writing. But if that is like something that you don't want to have to like think about or deal with, just remember, make sure you set the data source, okay? Because if you don't set the data source, that is like probably the #1 issue that people run into when they're like, oh, my table view is not displaying anything, right? That's probably because the source is empty, right? If the source is empty, there's nothing to display. If there's nothing to display, then you see nothing, okay? So that's one thing to do. And the second part is you need to tell the table view its delegate, okay? So remember, back from last week, we talked about this chef, customer, and this menu kind of analogy, right, between the delegate, delegator, and the protocol. And the idea, just to summarize it again, is that the protocol is a way for the delegate and the delegator to communicate, right? And the idea is that the delegator is the person assigning the work, and the delegate is the person doing the work, right? So in this example, what you're saying is table view, right, is a new view that I'm creating, must have some way, right, to kind of make the parent view do some work, right? Because the parent view is the one that has all the data. So let's think about back to Spotify, right? Let's say, for example, the parent view has a list of songs, right? And in my table view controller, I'm deleting some songs. So if I delete some songs, I need some way for the parent to kind of like update its storage of the songs, right? So the way I would do that is table view dot delegate, which is going to refer to the parent view, right? And then delete some songs, right? For example. Okay, so that's what the second line is doing here. So yeah, I'm trying to go as slow as possible because a lot of the times people like don't actually know what these two lines are actually doing. There's like, oh, they did it in the demo, so let me just copy it, right? So this is basically what you're doing here, right? Data source is to like say where my data is coming from, and the delegate is to make sure that you're able to kind of pass whatever information that you change in the table view to some other view, right? And the way you like how do you get that some other view? Well, you just set that other view to be the delegate, and then now you have access to it, right? Because in the table view, you just do table view dot delegate, do the function. Okay, cool. So that's what these two lines are doing. This one I'm going to defer to later, but the idea is that we have this thing called a cell reuse identifier, and that's primarily used if you have like a lot of cells, right? And you don't want to like create a new cell for each of the kind of piece of data, so you kind of reuse things, right? Reduce, reuse, recycle kind of idea here. Okay, so I'll talk more about this later in an example. But those are just like the 3 lines of new setup that you have to do if you're using a table view, right? So you don't have to set the data source, the delegate, and register something for like a label, for like a text view, but you do have to do that for a table view, okay? And then finally, make sure you add it, right? Again, common mistake, but if you don't add it, you can't see it, right? All right. Yes. Let me just move this. Here we go. Yes. So data source. Oh, okay, I forgot I had these slides, so I just talked about it from the previous slides. Okay, but I do have these slides. So let me just do this in one sentence. Again, right? Data source. The idea is that you have the data source specified, so the table view knows where it's getting its data from. Okay. And yes, so one thing that you need to make sure, like, to remember to implement as well, when you're creating a table view controller, and like Xcode will prompt you, because if you forget to write these functions, your code will not compile, right? But the idea is that you need to specify these 2 things at least, and everything else is optional. The first one is number of rows per section. So remember how I went, if you remember back to the settings app that I showed you, right? Where you have the first section be just the person's profile. I can just actually go back. Here, right? So the first section here, or the 0th section, is just the person's profile. So I have 1 cell there. The second section has 5 things in it. The second section has 4 things in it, etc., right? So how does the table view know how many things it needs to populate, right? And it doesn't, right? You have to tell it. You have to tell it. So that's why you need to specify the number of rows per section, right? And there's like I'm going to show you an example of like what that looks like later. But the idea is that you need to tell it, right? And it's okay if each section has different numbers of rows, right? But just make sure that you define that somewhere. And if you only have like 1 section, so if the section number is just the 0th section, then you can just pass in like a constant, right? Because that's just going to be the number of rows in your entire table view. Okay. And the second and probably the most important function is this function, or like this property. It's called self-row at. That's the name of the function. But the idea is that you need to tell the table view what cell to display at a specific row. Okay, and if you implement these two functions, you have a table view, right? That's basically it. Yeah, and so if you don't specify the number of sections, it's just going to default to default to 1. So you don't actually have to tell it the number of sections, but if you don't, just remember that the section number will be set to 1. Okay. And so these are the corresponding functions. It's number of rows in section, self-row at, number of sections. So you actually only have to remember these 3 like functions, right? When you go to actually implementing this in Xcode, the function name would be like 10 times the length because it has a bunch of other information in it. And so Elvis will go over this more in a lot more detail in the actual demo, where he'll be like kind of actually typing stuff into Xcode. But you only really have to type 2 or 3 characters of the name of this function, and then autocomplete will come to save the day, and it will just fill in everything else if you just press enter. Okay, so just like don't be scared. Actually, I can like skip ahead, but this is what it actually looks like, right? It's like really, really, really long. Like this has so like what this is saying is, right, I'm creating a table view data source, right? So you're basically having your view controller implement the data source, and it is a function of table view. This means it is an anonymous argument, and then it's going to take in a table view, and then this is the actual thing you need to care about, and that's like the section number. You don't have to care about any of this, right? The idea is that you just type in number of rows in section, it will autocomplete, and then you just fill in the information. Okay. Over here, I did table data.count because I'm storing the information for my table view in this variable called table data. But if you know, for example, that you have only 5 items to display, then you can just put 5. Okay. And again, right, see how this thing is really, really, really long? Forget about it, right? Let's just look at this part. This is the only thing you really need to look at. Self-row at, right? And it's pretty self-explanatory. What cell do I want to display at the specific row? Self-row at, okay? So those are the 2 functions that you have to implement when you're having your view controller implement the data source, right? This is something that we'll be talking about later, but the idea is that when you return, or like the return type of this function, so like you're specifying what cell to display at that row, right? The return type of that is going to be a cell, right? So you need to kind of create a cell in this function and then return that cell in this function. Okay. All right, so that was the first part, right? The first part is data source. So again, one more time, in the data source, you're specifying what or like where my table view is getting the information from, right? And this is like a type, right? Like you see how you're basically having it conform, right, to UITableView data source. And remember how like if you try to conform something to a protocol, you need to implement its functions, right? So over here, you're just implementing this number of rows in section function and this self-row at function. Okay, cool. So that's the data source part. Now let's talk about the delegate part. So the delegate part is actually a lot nicer in the sense that you don't have to actually like implement anything required, but there are 2 optional things you do need to implement. Sorry, you don't need to implement. The 2 optional things that you can implement. But as I mentioned before, right, the delegate is a way for you to kind of have the content of the table be passed back to the parent, or like have the contents of the cell be passed to the table, etc. Right, is a way you communicate between views. And the 2 optional things that you can implement, one is to specify the height of each row, right? So if you go back to the settings example here, and the first one is kind of tall, right? It's a lot more taller than the ones down there, and there's like a default height, right? So if you want different cells in different sections to have different heights, or in fact you can have different cells in the same section have different heights, right? That here is where you would specify. Here is where you would specify it when you implement the delegate. And you can also specify what happens. Oh, careful. You can also specify what happens when you select or deselect. That's like the term, but the idea is like when you click and when you like unselect a cell, right? So an example of this would be, say, like a shopping cart, right? If you click on something in a shopping app, right? When you click on something in the shopping app, it adds it to the cart. When you like unselect it or deselect it, it removes it from the cart, right? So that type of functionality would be implemented when you implement the delegate. And it looks something like this, right? This is the function. It's called height for row at, and the functions for implementing the selecting and deselecting logic is called did select row at and did deselect row at. Okay, so you can see like a pretty common theme of like something row at, right? Because the idea is that the functionality is like reused for basically all the rows, right? It's just that like what are you doing differently to the row, right? But like the idea is that all the rows are like basically treated the same way. It's just that what you want to do to them is a little different, right? So it's like the height of it, you know, if you click on it and if you don't click on it and stuff like that. Okay. All right, so again, right, this is what the functions look like, right? A bit long, kind of ugly, but just pay attention to these, like the parts here, okay? Height for row at, did deselect row at, did deselect row at, okay? Those are things you need to pay attention to. And yeah, so the actual implementation doesn't really matter, but you'll see this in practice on Wednesday's demo, okay? All right, so I talked about the data source, where you kind of specify where you're getting your information from, where you would talk about the number of sections, how many rows you have for each section, and other information. And then I talked about the delegate, right? The delegate is used for you to communicate between the views, right? And it's also how you would specify behavior if you click on the cell or if you don't click on the cell, as well as like if you want a different height for the cell, stuff like that. Now, the third and final part is when you want to register a cell. Okay. So this is probably the more complicated part of a table view, but the idea is that you want your apps to look kind of cool, right? Look nice. And so you want to specify a custom cell to display instead of just using the built-in table view cell that Apple provides to you. Because the built-in table view cell is very, very limited, right? You can have like one label in the middle, maybe like one or two icons on like both sides, and that's about it, right? And so you can definitely not do something like this, right? These are custom cells. And if you've used, I think this is uplift and that is transit. But like it doesn't really matter, right, what these are. But the core part of the core takeaway here is that you can specify and customize these cells to look very nice. And this is nice for like when you're want to like make a really cool app. But how does your table view know which cell to use then, right? Because if you don't tell it what to use, then you just might as well just use the default one, right? So the way you specify which cell to use is by doing this, right? First, you have to register it, and the idea is that you basically give it like some string to kind of disambiguate it from other cells. So, say for example, you have different like 2 or 3 different cells, then you will like give them each a different name, so that in one table view, you want to display cell A. In the second table view, you can display cell B, right? Then you can use the reuse identifier to specify which one is which, right? And I can just show you here. Oh, okay. I thought I had the demo code for that. But okay, we can just use this thing here. So the idea is that the previous ones, you have like you're like extending these view controllers, or you're like implementing these protocols. But over here, you're just setting it as like a property, right? So this is the table view, and then just like how it's like dot auto translating, remasking, that type of thing, or like dot color, right? You do dot register, and then you pass in 2 things. One, you pass in the class of the cell. So just like how when you create a new view controller, you create a new class, right? You do file, new file, and then like Google Touch class, and you create a new file, right? Same thing here. When you create a new table view cell, right? You're gonna go through the same process, give it a name, maybe you call it like uplift gym table view cell, right? Maybe that's a name. So then you'll pass that name into here, right? So that's like the class of your cell. And then the second thing here, the reuse identifier, is basically a string which says like what this cell kind of displays. And the most important part of the string is that it's unique. Okay, so if you have like cell A and you have cell B, you make sure that the string that you use to identify them is different. Okay, so that's the purpose of registering, right? You want to register if you want to use a custom cell, right? Not the default cell that Apple provides to you. And when you use a custom cell and you register it, you must also give it a string. Okay, like the string doesn't have to be like like a hash or like a really complicated password. It could just be like gym cell and then like route cell, right? Like as long as the ID you give it to it is unique, then it's fine, right? Okay. Now, just to take a step back for a second. The reason why we have these reuse identifiers is because we don't want our phones to blow up. Okay. So say I have, again, Spotify here, and I have like thousands and thousands of songs, right? If I create a cell for each song in my table view, then I'm going to be creating a lot of cells, right? And, like if it's necessary, then fine, right? But a lot of the times this is not very necessary because, like the phone screen is only so big, right? Like you can't see all the cells, even if you create them all at once, right? So the whole point here is that we only create as many cells as we can visually see. So over here, we can say probably like 10, right? And you only create like around 10 cells. And the idea here is that once I scroll, right, some of the cells disappear. And like, so say for example, I'm scrolling up, right? If I scroll up, then the cells on the top disappear, or like they go out of view, and there are like more cells that appear from the bottom, right? So instead of just creating a new cell on the bottom, I can just take the cell that I scrolled off and put it on the bottom, right? So that's the idea of kind of reusing a cell. So the idea of dequeuing is when I scroll and it disappears, so it gets dequeued, and then reuse is when the one that gets dequeued then gets kind of reused back on the bottom. And so this allows us to save a lot of memory because we don't have to create a lot of extra cells that don't actually end up getting displayed. And this is also why this identifier is called a reuse identifier and not just like ID or something, right? It's because we use this reuse identifier to figure out, okay, so this cell got dequeued, it disappeared, right? Like what cell is it, right? And then we just check for its reuse identifier. And based on the reuse identifier, we see, oh, do I want to like reuse it in this table view or reuse it in that table? Okay, so it may seem a little redundant if I only have one table view, right? Because whatever cell I dequeue is like going to be the cell that I reuse, right? Because I only have one table view. But a lot of the setup for these things that we're building here are designed to like be very extensible, right? So say for example, I have like a bunch of table views going on at the same time, right? So you have like Netflix. Netflix is a good example because if you've used like the mobile apps before, you have like multiple videos going from left to right, but you also have videos going up from like top to bottom, right? Like there's a whole different bunch of like different flow layouts. So for things like that, then you have a bunch of different cells that are all there at the same time, and that's where the reuse identifier would be very helpful. Okay. All right. So that was a lot of talking, right? Let me just summarize what I talked about today. And this is hopefully going to be a good reminder. So the steps for setting up your table view, first you initialize and lay it out. And like by this, I just mean, you do like let's table view equals to UITableView bracket, right? That's like the initialization step. And the laying out is just when you put the constraints, right? So hopefully this step is very familiar. Like you've done this multiple times for the past projects. Now this part from step 2 to 5 is probably more foreign. So the second step is you want to create your custom UITableView cell. And I haven't talked about this yet, right? Because this is going to be the content of the demo where you'll see how we create a new cell, register the cell, and have that be presented in your table view. But the ideal set of steps is first you initialize and lay it out, then you create your custom cell. Because after you create the custom cell, then you can register it, right? So remember, if we go back to the notation here, it's the table view.register, right? So you want to create your table view, create your table view cell, and then you register your table view cell. Okay. Then finally, you set its data source and its delegate, right? Remember the functions that I talked about just now. The data source has 2 required functions, and the delegate has no required functions. Okay. And just make sure that your UI view controller, because the UI view controller is probably like the parent view controller, right? It's the one that's going to be kind of doing, it's going to be the one storing all the data, hence it's the data source, but it's also going to be the one where you pass the information back to, right? Hence it's the delegate. Okay. So you make sure that the UI view controller conforms to these, or if you're going to use, say for example, in the hack challenge, you have more than 2 views, right? You have, say, like a bunch of like views that are like in a chain, right? Then in that case, it won't be the UI view controller that conforms to it. It's whatever that serves the purpose for these 2, data source and the delegate, right? So the data source is the one that provides the data, and the delegate is the one that kind of like is going to use whatever information you gain from the table view. So like, what the person clicked, right? Where the person scrolled, right? Like those type of information, right? The delegate is going to be the one that uses that information. Okay. All right. Okay, I'll leave this up on the screen. Does anybody have any questions about this step? If not, we're going to move on to the Kahoot. Cool. All right, let's get started. So you should go. Okay. Anybody still trying to connect? Maybe one more minute. Okay, so we're gonna start. All right, 3, 2, 1. Wait, what's going on? Where? Oh, there we go. Okay, so which of the following is false? So is the table view composed of sections? A table view is composed of rows. A section is composed of rows, and each row has a corresponding table view cell. So which of these is false? Nice, right? So a table view is not composed of rows because a table view is composed of sections, and the sections are composed of rows, right? I mean, of course, if you don't specify how many sections and you just have like one section, then yeah, a table view is a bunch of rows, but strictly the hierarchy is view and then section and then row. Okay. I'll move this to here. Okay, nice. All right, so which of these following are optional, or are, because it could be one, it could be none, optional to implement? Nice. Oh, okay. So that's actually wow. Okay, that's actually quite an interesting split. So yeah, this is multi-select, so you can like there could be multiple that are optional. So number of rows in section is required, right? Because if you don't specify the number of rows in the section, then like you cannot lay out anything because I don't know how many rows are going to be in the section. So that's definitely required. No, so the default one is number of sections.
Oh,
Yeah. So the number of rows in the section you need to specify, right? So if you don't specify the number of sections, then it defaults to one. Yes. And the self row out is also required, right? Because if you don't tell me what is in that row, then like I don't know what to show, right? So these two are definitely required. Now, deselect did select row out as well as the did deselect row out is optional, right? You can have like no functionality if you click on it. In fact, a lot of the apps have like no functionality when you click on it. And similarly, the height for raw, if you don't specify what the height is, it just kind of guesses the height. Or I think, yeah, I think it just guesses height. I actually forgot. It might default to a value. But the idea is that's also optional. Okay. All right, nice. A change in leaderboard. Okay, so what could be happening if you aren't seeing anything? Right, so I may not have mentioned everything here, but just think about like what we talked about today, and if some of these things happen, like it doesn't make sense, right? For you not to see anything. Right, so these are all correct, right? If the data source is not set, then I can't display anything, right? So there is no data. If the number of rows in section is set to 0, then basically you're saying I have a bunch of sections, right? But they're all empty, so therefore you'll see nothing. If the row is not configured, that basically means your cell for row at returns like an empty cell. Then you'll just see a bunch of empty cells, which is going to be basically nothing. And finally, if you have some issues with constraints, right, then of course, hopefully this is familiar. If you have constraints issues, then yeah, you'll see nothing. Okay, so these are all correct. All right, nice. So last question. What are table views made up of? This is actually meant to be the first question, but whatever. Nice, right. So there are sections that contains rows. This was supposed to be the first question, but you know what, whatever. All right, cool. So thanks for coming today. On Wednesday, we'll be going through a demo for showing you how to actually set these things up. So hopefully you retain what we talked about today, but if you don't, that's okay because we'll be showing you in demos anyways. All right, cool.